Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. When David Ranta was introduced to the world as the man police suspected of killing a prominent Brooklyn rabbi, he was described as a 35-year-old unemployed drug addict with a criminal record. Most people who read that description nodded along. An unemployed drug addict? Sounds the type, all right. And they were relieved. Every violent crime is horrific, but what Rabbi Chaskell Wurzburger had endured was especially heartbreaking. This was a man who had survived a World War II concentration camp, who came out the other side of that nightmare to settle in New York in 1949 and overcome the trauma he had endured through the faith that guided him the rest of his life. He met and married his wife Rivka, and the two moved into the Independence Towers, a housing project in 1965, where they stayed for 25 years. Then came February 8, 1990. Wurzburger had left his home, as he did almost every morning, shortly before 6 a.m. to go to the temple to turn up the heat so the synagogue would be comfortable for incoming worshipers. After the rabbi had climbed into his 1985 Oldsmobile, a man ran toward his car with a gun in his hand. That guy had just tried to rob a diamond courier on the street nearby, but the courier had managed to escape, so the robber was trying to commandeer Wurzburger's car to give chase. The bullet entered above his left eye. When paramedics arrived, Wurzburger was unconscious but still breathing, according to a Newsday report. He underwent 4 hours of surgery to have the bullet removed and then was put on life support that his doctors hoped would give his body time to heal, not just from the bullet wound itself, but also from the resulting swelling that endangered his life. Dr. Russ Knuckles told Newsday he was cautiously optimistic the rabbi would pull through, but he didn't. 4 days after he was shot, Wurzburger died. It was a high-profile killing, one that police initially thought had a racial motivation. The gunman at first was described as Hispanic, and there had been tensions between Jewish and Hispanic residents living in Williamsburg. But that description soon was updated to a 5'11" white man with blonde hair, and the attempted robbery of the jewel courier underscored that Wurzburger had unfortunately been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still, police wanted answers. 40 officers were assigned to the investigative team, which soon was helmed by a gruff, cigar-chewing cop straight out of Central Casting. Word on the street was that David Ranta had committed the crime, but Ranta had denied any involvement in the rabbi's death in an interview with other cops. But this cop? Well, he had a nickname. He was called the Closer, and for good reason. Bad guys just seemed to want to confess to him their sins. Ranta did just that, the cop would say after his interrogation. He didn't come right out and say, "I killed Rabbi Wurzburger," but he supposedly said 3 words that jurors would soon decide were just as incriminating. "I was there." Ranta was sentenced to 37 years to life. He insisted he had never said the words that New York police detective Louis Scarcella attributed to him. It took 23 years before the court system believed him.
David Ranta spent most of his adult life behind bars.
Do you have any one thing you want to do?
Get the hell out of here, maybe.
Let's go.
And so he did. The father of 3 adult children will try to begin a new life. In Brooklyn, John Slattery, CBS 2 News.
But Ranta wasn't the only inmate saying he had been railroaded by Scarcella. Dozens more alleged the same. Once Ranta's conviction was overturned and the charges against him dismissed, the floodgates opened to unearth one of the biggest crime-fighting scandals in New York history, one that's still unfolding to this day. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by Beam. I am so hot and cold when it comes to sleep, not just physically, but mentally too. Sometimes I'll be exhausted, but my body will simply refuse to cooperate. So if I'm not feeling ready for sleep come bedtime, Beam's Dream Powder is my go-to solution. I love this stuff. I make mine with milk. Beam's Dream is so decadent and yet totally guilt-free because there's no added sugar. Listen to these flavors: sea salt caramel, brownie batter, vanilla chai, cinnamon cocoa. They're all so good, and each serving is only 15 calories. And get this, Dream is tested for high-quality efficacy and formulated to ease your body into rest, supporting all 4 stages of the sleep cycle to help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. Other sleep aids can cause next-day grogginess, but Dream contains a powerful, all-natural blend of reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, apigenin, and melatonin to help you fall asleep, stay asleep, and wake up refreshed. My listeners get a special discount on Beam's Dream Powder. There's science-backed healthy hot cocoa for sleep with no added sugar. Better sleep has never tasted better. If you want to try Beam's best-selling Dream Powder, get up to 40% off for a limited time when you go to shopbeam.com/COTC and use code COTC at checkout. That's shop BEAM/COTC and use code COTC for up to 40% off. Before we talk about Louis Scarcella, let me introduce a man who's going to help me tell this story. His name is Steve Fishman.
Feel free to guide me because there's a lot to cover and I tend to ramble.
Fishman had been a longtime staff writer for New York Magazine, writing some high-profile stories on criminal cases like Bernie Madoff's, before he fell in love with podcasting. In 2018, Fishman made a podcast called Empire on Blood that reached the top of Apple Podcasts. And after that, he started looking for another topic worthy of a deep dive. It didn't take him long to find one.
There was this guy in the news, quite a lot, a detective named Louis Scarcella, who was dubbed disgraced detective, who was accused of being a corrupt detective, who was, in fact, the great detective of the 80s and 90s, an era in New York when the city seemed like it was, frankly, about to be overrun by crime.
He's not kidding. New York in this time period was a nightmare.
There were like 2,000 murders. I think one year there was 2,500 murders a year. I mean, people were scared to death.
So it's Fishman who reached out to me about telling Scarcella's story, and his timing was perfect. Let's just say I'm covering some overlapping issues at my day job at the Cincinnati Enquirer. This was right up my alley. Anyway, back to Louis Scarcella. To put it lightly, he had been born into an interesting New York family.
He explains that his father's a cop, his brother's a cop, his daughter works for the district attorney, but his uncle was a mobster.
Fishman talked to Scarcella for literally dozens of hours for his podcast, The Burden, the first season of which was dedicated to this case.
It turned out that he kind of respected his father, a quiet man who liked to read, but he adored his uncle Nicky, who was a captain in the Colombo crime family.
Now listen, we can't help who we're related to, but we can help if we idolize those relatives. And Nicky Grancio, aka Nicky Black, is a fraught character to idolize. From New York City Crime Spot on YouTube.
By the early 1980s, Nicky Black was playing a huge role in the Colombo family. He had become a powerhouse, with an ability to influence various businesses through his position with the Teamsters, and apparently had no problem assisting in making people disappear.
So yeah, on one side of Scarcella's family, he's got a bunch of crime fighters, and on the other side, he has, well, the opposite. At least one crime maker. And Scarcella wasn't shielded from him either.
There's this great scene that he narrates about being 12 years old and in the front seat of a car with his Uncle Nicky, and shots come through the windshield. Somebody's trying to assassinate him. And luckily his uncle's a great wheelman and does a sharp turn and evades death. But Louis is just enamored of him.
That would have been around 1963. Fast forward some 20 years, and Nicky was a major underworld figure. And while he wasn't making a ton of headlines in this era, a good mobster shouldn't, I suppose, his nephew was. Scarcella had joined the force in the 70s, and by the 80s and 90s, he was hot shit. You can see it in newspaper coverage at the time. Scarcella was a pretty regular fixture in papers that covered New York City crime, and, as Fishman said, there was a lot of crime and a lot of coverage of that crime. And Scarcella was like a quote factory.
Listen, he's a great storyteller.
That's an understatement.
You know, Scarcella was a man of action, and he continued to tell these amazing stories. You know, he saw a guy commit a crime, assault somebody else, and then, I believe, jump in a car. And so Scarcella runs into the street, and there's a taxi there, and he says, "Get out of your car, I need your car, I'm a cop." He's holding up his badge, so he commandeers this car, and like a 60-mile-an-hour chase in the middle of Brooklyn.
I found one article from February 1981 that quotes Scarcella testifying about an arrest, and it's like a scene from a movie. Scarcella described arriving at a house occupied by a guy named Salvatore DiSarno, nicknamed Crazy Sal, which, if we're being honest, isn't the kind of nickname that makes you think the character will stay on screen for very long. Am I right? Scarcella said he arrived at the house Crazy Sal had holed up in and spotted what he thought might be a pile of burned rags on the lawn. But he had to be careful about checking the pile out because DiSarno was barricaded inside with a 60-year-old woman he had taken hostage. So Scarcella military crawled to the bundle and found it was actually the body of a colleague, Officer Cecil Sledge. It was an awful case. DiSarno had shot Sledge 4 times in the head, then backed his car up over the body and dragged him a half-mile through the streets. Scarcella said he and other officers eventually hauled DiSarno from the house, and Scarcella said that DiSarno screamed, "I killed Sledge," the whole time he was driving him to lockup. DiSarno, I'll note, is still in prison to this day for that crime, and by all accounts, that's where he belongs. After this news story, Scarcella's name started routinely appearing in New York media. He seemed to be the point person for multiple crime reporters, and he gave great quotes. About a shootout that killed one, he said, quote, "It was a miracle only one person died. There were at least 20 people on the street, and the bullets were flying," end quote. about a woman who managed to save herself in a vicious stabbing, quote, "I'll never forget her as long as I live. She had more guts than many, many men I know. She's unbelievable," end quote. About another woman who didn't manage to save herself, quote, "It was just this 77-year-old woman sitting in a chair with an axe embedded in her head," end quote. These were all big, newsworthy cases, but the David Ranta arrest, the one from the top of the episode, catapulted Scarcella in a way the other cases didn't. He said Ranta confessed to him, that whole "I was there" admission, and from that point forward, it seemed Scarcella rarely met a criminal who wasn't ready to sing to him. Well, except his uncle. Amazingly, at one point, Louis Scarcella had been assigned to interview his own uncle, his mobster uncle, for murder. This wasn't some clandestine operation either. Scarcella's police bosses knew the two were related and allowed Scarcella to investigate the case anyway. The victim was a drug dealer who Nicky Black believed had been supplying his, as in Nicky's, kid with drugs. Nicky was suspected of killing the dealer. He did not confess to Scarcella, and the case was never solved. Later, Scarcella would tell Fishman that some homicides fit the definition of a so-called public service murder, as in, sometimes people are bad and deserve to die. The drug dealer's death, he said, fit the criteria. Now, when Scarcella interviewed homicide suspects who weren't his uncle, he had a much higher closure rate.
You know, Scarcella really started out in a different world than the world we have. He called it the crazy world of murder. He talked about leaving the precinct at night and hearing the shots of what his next murder would be, his next assignment would be the following day. And Detective Scarcella embraced it. He told me, "I am the protector of this neighborhood, and I love doing it."
He investigated hundreds of cases. He closed hundreds of them, too. Asked during one court hearing how many arrests of his had not led to convictions, he couldn't recall a single one. And a lot of them involved confessions. It was amazing how many people seemed to bare their souls to Louis Scarcella. But here's the thing. Those same suspects who seemed so willing to confess to Scarcella when he interviewed them alone had a habit of recanting straight away. Not recanting like, "Oh wait, I didn't mean to say that," but denying they had ever said anything incriminating at all. They accused Scarcella of straight up fabricating statements. No one listened to them. Most of them had prior records, after all. Most of them were young black men, and a lot of the victims were high risk too, like drug dealers, the types of victims whose deaths don't make big headlines, especially not in a city hitting 2,000 homicides a year. I mean, who would you expect a jury to believe? A repeat offender with a rap sheet the length of your arm, or a decorated detective? The juries believed Scarcella. So did the media. Here's Scarcella on an episode of Dr. Phil.
Are there rules when it comes to homicides? No, there are none. I will do whatever I have to do within the law to get a confession.
When Scarcella retired in 1999, he did so a legend. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Miracle Made. I swear I could talk about my finicky sleep for an hour. Miracle Made Sheets helps with one of my most physically uncomfortable problems. I can get too hot at night using other sheets. But Miracle Made? Well, they're infused with silver that prevents up to 99.7% of bacterial growth to help them stay cleaner and fresh 3 times longer than other sheets. This means no more gross odors. Miracle Made sheets are thermoregulating and designed to keep you at the perfect temperature all night long, no matter the weather. And let me tell you, these things feel luxurious and comfortable. It's amazing they don't come with a high price tag of other luxury brands, yet feel nicer than most 5-star hotel sheets. Go to trymiracle.com/COTC to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code COTC at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle Made is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/COTC and use the code COTC to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/COTC to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by Quince. It's time to shift my wardrobe from summer to fall, which is always a challenge, especially right now in Ohio where it's dry as hell and still in the 80s and 90s well into September. Still, I know more temperate weather is coming, and I'm excited to check out Quince to get ready for it. Quince has great, high-quality items I adore and prices that ensure I don't blow my budget. Like cashmere sweaters from $50, pants for every occasion, washable silk tops, and so much more. As soon as it dips back down into the 70s, I'm pulling out my long sleeve but lightweight Quince dress, which is so comfortable and yet still work appropriate. The best part? All Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They do this by partnering directly with top factories. That way, Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to us. And, this is important to me, Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. I love that. Make switching seasons a breeze with Quince's high-quality closet essentials. Go to quince.com/COTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/COTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/COTC. David Ranta's conviction had been in May 1991. It didn't unravel until 2013. On March 21st of that year, Ranta walked out of prison a free man, telling reporters, quote, "I'm overwhelmed. Right now I feel like I'm underwater, swimming," end quote. The investigation that led to his release started with a single eyewitness who'd been just a teenager back when Rabbi Chaskell Wurzburger was killed. The witness came forward to say that all those years earlier, he had arrived at the police department for a suspect lineup. He had never told anyone this before, but he said that a detective had told him to pick the man with the quote-unquote big nose out of the lineup. Ranta had been the only guy there with a nose that fit the bill, and so the kid did as he was told. He ID'd Ranta. After the witness came forward, the district attorney's conviction integrity unit conducted a year-long investigation and found more problems. They approached 2 other witnesses who had testified in the case, and those 2 said they had lied. Not only that, but they were career criminals who said that in exchange for testifying against Ranta, Louis Scarcella had let them out of jail multiple times to buy drugs, eat meals, and visit sex workers. Another guy had likely been the killer, and Scarcella knew it. He had followed up on a tip that said a robber named Joseph Aston had gunned down the rabbi in the botched robbery. But then Joseph Aston died in a car crash, and it would appear Scarcella, ever the skilled storyteller, didn't find that ending satisfying enough. After Ranta's release, Scarcella denied any wrongdoing. Here he is on CBS.
I stand by the confession. I stand by the case.
Did you coach witnesses?
No, sir.
Did you ever instruct a 13-year-old witness to pick out the guy with the big nose?
I don't, never, no, sir. No, sir.
Other convicts were paying attention. Some were part of a jailhouse law firm called Actual Innocence, which began at a correctional facility in Auburn, New York. There, several inmates who insisted they hadn't done what they were serving time for had learned to become their own advocates. Some of them didn't even realize their cases had Detective Louis Scarcella in common until after Ranta's release. Now, it's worth noting here that Ranta's case was different than several of these other cases in two key ways. First, Ranta was white. And second, his supposed victim wasn't high risk. He was a rabbi beloved in his community. A lot of the people who'd been saying Scarcella was dirty were black men accused of killing other black men, and, to put it bluntly, not a lot of people cared to listen to what they had to say. Shabaka Shakur had been sentenced to 20 years to life in 1989 for the murder of 2 drug dealers. He once told a reporter, quote, "Basically, the system says, we don't care about your innocence. We're just here to make sure you have a fair trial. You had a lawyer, you met the minimum standard of what you were supposed to get in court. Whether you're innocent or not is not our issue." End quote. But Ranta's exoneration made it an issue. It was bad press. Ranta, the poor guy, actually had a heart attack within days of his release, which he luckily survived. After he got out, the New York Times' Francis Roble helmed an investigation that found a number of confessions Scarcella supposedly nailed had similar verbiage. People often seemed to say to Scarcella, "You were right," and/or "I was there." It wasn't the kind of phrasing that would stand out in any single case, but when taking a broader look at the detective's work, it seemed fishy that suspects would say variations of the same thing again and again. In some of Scarcella's cases, there was another overlap too, as explained by news anchor Debbie Turner-Bell on an episode of Arise America.
Louis Scarcella used a woman by the name of Teresa Gomez, who is a known crack addict, as a witness that contributed to their conviction. Also used this same witness in 6 other cases.
It's not the most empathetic way to describe Teresa Gomez, but the overall facts here are accurate. Like a number of people in the 1980s and 90s, Gomez had gotten hooked on the crystal form of cocaine. Scarcella met her during one of his homicide investigations. She told him she had information on a murder, and he put her on the stand. That on its own isn't particularly noteworthy. Police and prosecutors can't always be picky when they're finding witnesses to crimes. Sometimes they're going to have addiction issues or rap sheets, so it goes. But Teresa Gomez didn't just testify in the one case. As Turner-Bell said, she testified in 6 of Scarcella's cases, all of which happened separate from each other. Now, on one hand, you can argue that one person witnessing 6 murders isn't that much of a stretch in a high-crime area. Sure, most people don't witness a murder even once in their lifetime, but Gomez lived in a hotbed. So maybe she just had an unfortunate address and a pure-hearted desire to put killers behind bars.
But let's look at it another way.
This is Dax Devlin Ross, a journalist who co-hosts The Burden with Steve Fishman in Season 1, Episode 4.
For Scarcella, having this witness who over and over again will help him close cases, that had to be great for his career. Let's just look at the record. Within a few years of meeting Teresa Gomez, he was promoted to the elite Brooklyn North homicide. He went from a lowly 3rd grade to a 1st grade detective, the highest level a detective can achieve.
Scarcella is among the first to acknowledge Teresa Gomez helped his career.
I was very happy because I was a 3rd grade for a number of years, and I did think that this would help my career. I'd lie to you. Look, my father was a 3rd grade detective for 27 years. He never made grade. It took me 20 years to make 1st grade. I knew she was helping me, and I would lie to you if I said no.
According to the New York Times, Gomez first helped Scarcella on a couple of cases in the late 1980s. She testified that she saw a drug dealer named Robert Hill commit 2 separate murders. From the Times story, quote, "In the first trial, she said she was hiding in a closet in a crack den watching through a keyhole in the door and saw Mr. Hill put a pillow over a man's head and shoot him. Mr. Hill's cousin said the family later hired an investigator and found no keyhole in the closet door. Mr. Hill was acquitted. In the second trial, Mr. Hill was accused of shooting a man on a Crown Heights street corner and then, curiously, putting the dying man inside a livery cab and ordering the driver to take him to the hospital." End quote. The second victim's surname was Mambordez. Hill insisted he had nothing to do with that shooting, and what's wild is that in the first trial, Gomez was asked about this murder and she said at that time, under oath, that she didn't know anything about it. Yet within a few months, she was testifying as the lone witness to that murder. Back to the New York Times, quote, "Ms. Gomez's testimony was so belligerent that the judge threatened to strike it in its entirety. She contradicted the evidence in several ways, including the direction the shot was fired and the color of the cab. She even admitted she lied during the first trial, yet Mr. Hill was convicted." End quote. Not long after, Gomez was a witness in the trial against Robert Hill's stepbrothers, who were charged with killing a man in a robbery. Though Gomez's testimony was muddled and often contradicted other witnesses' descriptions of what happened, the convictions against Darrell Austin and Alvina Jeanette stuck. All 3 brothers' convictions would be vacated in 2013, so after nearly a quarter century in prison, thanks to the Kings County District Attorney's Conviction Integrity Unit, though by the time those exonerations came, Austin had already died in prison of lung disease. Hill, Jeanette, and Austin's estate were awarded nearly $30 million combined for the wrongful convictions. So at this point, 4 of Scarcella's convictions had been overturned, but we're still only scratching the surface. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by IQ Bar. I've mentioned I work a bit too much, right? I'm a daily journalist, I run the podcast network Grab Bag Collab, and I helm this here podcast. Sometimes I run out of time to do much of anything that isn't work, and that includes eating proper meals. But I have to say, ever since I got the IQ Bar sampler pack, I've been feeling a lot healthier, and you can too. Start each day right with IQ Bar's brain and body boosting bars, hydration mixes, and mushroom coffees. Their ultimate sampler pack includes all 3, and right now, IQ Bar is offering our podcast listeners an exclusive deal. 20% off all IQ Bar products, plus get free shipping. Now, all of these products from IQ Bar are entirely free from gluten, dairy, soy, GMOs, and artificial sweeteners. IQ Joe is a jitter-free instant coffee packed with 200 milligrams of natural caffeine and more of that magnesium and lion's mane. Ooh, and by the way, they have a limited edition pumpkin spice flavor while supplies last. I gotta go try some of that. And right now, IQ Bar is offering our special podcast listeners 20% off all IQ Bar products, plus get free shipping. To get your 20% off, just text Centuries to 64,000. Text Centuries to 64,000. That's CENTURIES to 64,000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
When most people think of the Atlanta Olympic Park bombing, they think of Richard Jewell, a security guard who was first painted as a hero by the media, but later became a suspect in the FBI's investigation. But in the summer of 1996, it was Eric Rudolph, a terrorist and dedicated soldier in the white supremacist Christian identity movement, who executed the bombing and escaped into the night. And that's all most people know about him. What most people don't know about him is that before withdrawing from civilization, he also bombed 2 abortion clinics and a lesbian nightclub. What even fewer people know about him is that he eluded the authorities for 5 years in the mountains of North Carolina until his eventual capture in 2003. And what I didn't know about him was how our 2 lives were connected. From iHeart and Tenderfoot TV, I'm Cole Lacasio, and this is Flashpoint. All 8 episodes are available to binge now. Listen for free on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And join Tenderfoot Plus for an ad-free binge experience.
Inmates inside of prisons often have to become law experts themselves, especially if they're poor, black, and/or actually innocent of the crimes that got them there. That's because while our legal system supposedly gives unconvicted people the presumption of innocence, once they're convicted, that presumption goes out the window. From then on, they're guilty. All of those appeals hearings you've heard about that come after the conviction are weighed in favor of the prosecution. So even well-intentioned, dedicated, skilled lawyers at the appellate level have a hard time getting convictions overturned, even if their clients are innocent. Derek Hamilton was a guy behind bars who swore he didn't do what he was convicted of doing. At least, not this time.
Derek Hamilton is a guy who spent a number of his childhood years in a housing project, which was very violent and a real center of drug activity. And Derek shot people. He told us he shot people. He pled guilty to shooting people. So he comes with a reputation as a dangerous criminal.
On January 3rd, 1991, a young woman named Jewel Smith left her boyfriend's apartment to go to a store. It'd been a long day already. Jewel had earlier bailed her boyfriend, 26-year-old Nathaniel Cash, out of jail. When she got back shortly after midnight on January 4th, she found Cash lying on the ground, shot to death. Jewel said she didn't know who had done it. Louis Scarcella was the lead detective, and after he interviewed Jewel, she changed her story. She ultimately testified that she had seen Hamilton shoot Cash. Though Jewel recanted this before Hamilton was sentenced, saying that Scarcella threatened to charge her with the murder, Hamilton got 25 years to life in prison for second-degree murder.
Derek Hamilton goes to prison, and in prison, he makes himself into a jailhouse lawyer, like an elite jailhouse lawyer. I mean, the guy's incredibly smart. And you know, you think about a guy like this growing up maybe in a middle-class home, he'd be a lawyer, I don't know, he'd be an investment banker. But he grew up where he grew up, and he goes into prison and he studies the law. He tells me the law was my girlfriend. I had to love it. It was my only way to freedom. Because Derek Hamilton says, I shot people, but I did not kill this guy.
While imprisoned, Hamilton wrote a number of appeals and even found witnesses who identified someone else as the shooter. Not only that, but he presented alibi witnesses who provided affidavits swearing they had seen Hamilton at a party the time the murder was committed. But remember, the presumption of guilt was now in effect. The judges hearing these appeals never found the other witnesses credible enough to overrule that presumption. While his own case languished, Hamilton helped other inmates with theirs. He filed motions and briefs and studied case law, and eventually co-founded a group called Actual Innocence with other inmates fighting for their own release. One day, he was reviewing one of his partner's briefs.
And he looks at it and he says, wait, you got Scarcella in your case too? And Derek says, that's the same motherfucker who framed me. And that's like an electric moment because this guy that he talks to is a guy named Shabaka Shakur, also a very intelligent guy, also very good with the law. And it really is a moment, as one defense attorney told me, that changes New York legal history. Because these guys get together and they find a third law partner who also has Scarcella in his case. And they say to one another, we got to get at this guy. And really, they start the ball rolling.
Now, these guys realizing that their cases shared a detective on its own wouldn't have meant much. After all, Scarcella had handled a lot of cases, and he was a celebrated figure, and they were just criminals. So of course most people within the system would normally have said, so what? Guilty guys say they're innocent all the time. Of course they're going to hate the guy who got them convicted. But in 2011, Kings County's Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines had created the Conviction Integrity Unit, and it was through that David Ranta's case got another look, which is how his case was overturned, and once that happened, Hamilton and his cohorts gathered all the info they could about their own cases.
They get that information to a New York Times reporter, a brand new New York Times reporter named Francis Robles, who goes by the nickname Frenchie. It's like a name out of a film noir.
Frenchie examines their cases and reports for the first time that something seems off about Scarcella's methods.
Not only his methods, but his, in some sense, whole way of looking at the world is being challenged. And frankly, being undermined.
Now, Prosecutor Hines was voted out in 2013, and a new guy, Kenneth Thompson, replaced him as Brooklyn DA. Thompson changed the name from Conviction Integrity Unit to Conviction Review Unit, the idea being that the emphasis should be on making sure prosecutors got it right and weren't just looking at old cases to defend their work. Thompson also put more money into the unit, which was soon touted as a model for other jurisdictions. After Ranta, Thompson's office began a review of about 70 of Scarcella's cases, resulting in 10 overturned convictions in its first year alone. Derek Hamilton's was just one of them.
An emotional day in court as a man walks free after spending nearly 25 years in prison. A judge today threw out the murder conviction for Eliseo de Leon after his lawyer said his confession back in 1996 was forced by a now disgraced detective.
Former NYPD Detective Louis Scarcella testifying today in a hearing for a man who claims he was wrongfully convicted in the 1995 murder of a 4-year-old Brooklyn girl.
Scarcella was once a leading homicide detective in Brooklyn, but his investigative tactics have come into question after Scarcella was accused of framing dozens of innocent men. In recent years, 15 of the convictions he helped secure were overturned.
The number of exonerations is around 20 now, and it includes 3 from 2023. That case had been particularly brutal. The assailants had approached a subway token booth in Brooklyn and poured gasoline through the slot. They lit a book of matches and tossed it inside. The booth exploded, sending the clerk inside of it flying, his body in flames. The clothes he was wearing burned off of him. He suffered horribly. He didn't die until 2 weeks later. The 3 convicted of the crime, Vincent Ellerby, James Irons, and Thomas Malick, who were all just 17 and 18 at the time, confessed to Scarcella and his then partner. The teens had been sentenced to 25 years to life. The Brooklyn DA's review unit determined the confessions had been coerced, and the men, now in their mid-40s, had been wrongfully convicted. Ellerby told the court, quote, 25 years, I had to look in the mirror knowing that I was in prison for something I had nothing to do with. The penitentiary breaks you or turns you into a monster, and I had to become something I'm not just to survive. End quote. To date, Scarcella has cost taxpayers $110 million in settlements to more than a dozen people. And Frenchie Robles, who's still reporting about the case at the New York Times, wrote in November that the payout figure is, quote, expected to rise by tens of millions more because the men cleared last year of burning a subway token clerk alive in 1995, have filed claims against the state, end quote. This might seem like a happy ending for these people who had their lives ripped away from them, but bear in mind, some of the recipients' families received this money because the actual victims died while in prison or soon after their release. One of the guys awarded a payout had been just 14 years old when he was arrested, a literal child. You can't get those years back. Scarcella, meanwhile, faces no charges. The DA's office has repeatedly said that while he concocted false witness testimony and coerced confessions and withheld evidence, that's just unethical behavior, not illegal. I admit I wonder if that's the real reason the DA doesn't want to look deeper. After all, the DA's office back in the day had put Scarcella's witnesses on the stand and had presented his false and concocted confessions to juries. They had noticed him using Teresa Gomez repeatedly. Internally, they even referred to her as Scarcella's go-to witness, and they never questioned it. It might behoove them to keep presenting him as a rogue detective rather than a symptom of a bigger problem. Scarcella, who's now well into his 70s and a quarter century into his retirement, continues to maintain he did nothing wrong. To research this story, I spent weeks reading, listening, and talking about Louis Scarcella. There's no definitive book yet. Frenchie Robles, I'm happy to help if you want to get to it. So a lot of information is still piecemeal. You have to find it case by case. The podcast The Burden is a really great presentation of how it all unfolded, so if you like long-form investigative podcasts, I recommend it. I'm going to drop a portion of episode 1 here next week when I'm off, as a thank you to Steve Fishman for bringing me this case. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.